And a lot of people may not know this, but the Dalai Lama is a socialist. Don't take my word for it, take his word for it, because he has said so. The question is, why is he a socialist? To answer that question, we've invited Terry Gibbs onto the program. Terry is Associate Professor of Political Science at Cape Breton University in Nova Scotia. She is author of a book entitled Why the Dalai Lama is a Socialist, Buddhism, Socialism, and the Compassionate Society. And she joins us now. So first of all, Terry, thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you for having me, Richard.
So actually what the Dalai Lama said, if I recall correctly, and also from your book, is I am a Marxist. Is that correct?
Yes, half Buddhist, half Marxist.
Half Buddhist, half Marxist. So I assume that surprised a lot of people, but you know, it was striking to me that when he made this statement, it didn't get very much attention. And you know, he's a very visible public figure. He's been used as a kind of global icon of peace and benign virtue, and he's even been used as the symbol for an Apple computer ad many years ago. So it all makes me wonder, before we get into the Dalai Lama and Buddhism and Socialism, why you think it is that people didn't respond to this, what I think is a attention-getting remark?
Well, there are a lot of reasons. I think the main one is that it's kind of embarrassing, and particularly in North America, that somebody this esteemed and respected around the world would actually dare to say such a thing in political environments where saying you're a Marxist or a socialist is still not really something that is accepted. And the fact that somebody that esteemed would actually come out and say it in public, I think in North American context was kind of embarrassing. So let's just sort of move on to the next thing that he has to say. And how could we possibly explain this? So I think there's an avoidance and a denial going on there.
Interesting. And you in your book, Why the Dalai Lama is a Socialist, you go pretty deeply into both Buddhism and socialism. Now, I think there's a popular conception or misconception that the two are inherently incompatible, that Buddhism, on the one hand, at least as it's understood in the West, and we can talk about that because I would argue misunderstood in the West, but that Buddhism in the West is a sort of individual practice, it's a solitary practice, it's the practice of meditating and going within yourself and liberating yourself from birth and death or just neuroses, depending on your level of ambition, I suppose, but that it is an individualistic belief system, and that socialism is a process of collective action, of social action, and so on, collective ownership. It takes different forms, but very few of them individualistic in nature. So how is it that you see these two as reconciling, if in fact there is a difference to begin with?
Yes, thank you. You bring up a lot of good questions. And I think definitely some socialists and some Buddhists would be uncomfortable, and probably are uncomfortable with the way that I do bring them together. I think that you're quite right that there's a lot of misconception about what Buddhism is, and we could have a long discussion about that. But I think for myself, I've sort of focused on socially engaged Buddhism in particular, and the Mahayana tradition in particular, to look at how a lot of Buddhist teachings could potentially help us to view the relationship between what are our sort of individual conscious daily activities and thoughts and what happens in our mind, and broader social systems and social structures. And clearly people like Thich Nhat Hanh, sort of the founder of socially engaged Buddhism, if you like, had a clear sense and have a clear sense that Buddhists are actively engaged in the world, and that your process of individual transformation and individual engagement is very much connected to the political processes that you're surrounded by, the environment that you're surrounded by. In his case, it was, Vietnam, the Vietnam War, that politicized him and made him sort of really think deeply about that question and have a call to other Buddhists to say, wow, we should explore that question.
And Thich Nhat Hanh is, of course, a Vietnamese Buddhist monk, still alive, but I think he's about 90 now, but for those of our listeners who don't know, during the Vietnam War, he was a leading opponent of the U.S.-backed regime in South Vietnam, and experienced jail and all sorts of forms of harassment, corresponded with Martin Luther King Jr., whose birthday we just celebrated. So he was perhaps the initiator of modern, what we call socially engaged Buddhism. And you write about awareness a little bit. You write about the practice of, Buddhism, preaches or teaches a kind of interconnectedness, and that if you sit in your room and ponder that or meditate on it, that the products you're heating may come from, communities that have been devastated by the extraction of fuels used to heat your house, and the products, could be that you have rubber products from produced by child labor who have harvested the rubber and so on. And I think that's an excellent point. And has the Dalai Lama himself spoken to this?
Well, the Dalai Lama, in many different occasions, has talked about universal responsibility. And the sense of, and one of the reasons that he is interested in Marxism and socialism is that he believes it's a moral philosophy, it's a moral way of exploring the universe and of thinking about what, in the language of my book, I would say are sort of the structural harms that we do when we don't recognize our interdependence. Interdependence is a sort of key idea that I talk about in the book because it's really at the heart of a lot of Buddhist philosophy. When we really, and practice, when we really begin to open up our awareness and to reflect on our interconnectedness with all beings, with the earth, with nature, with other animals, and we really have an understanding of that, it allows us to sort of see how we are connected both, and it's good news and bad news. It's the good news because we can begin to, well, maybe I should start with the bad news. It's the bad news because our activities, as you just pointed out a few, connect us in all sorts of intimate ways with people around the world. Before we finish breakfast in the morning, we've engaged with a whole ton of people who are engaged in production and consumption relationships. And there's a relationship between us and them. And so whether it's the coltan in our cell phone that's mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or maybe it's that, rainforests were cut down for the meat that we're eating, whatever it happens to be, but those interconnections are there. And so beginning to recognize that and see those connections, make them visible, allows us to begin to confront the choices that we're making on a daily level. And when we see ourselves as interdependent, when we're able to see those connections, we begin to act a little more compassionately because we realize, wow, everything that I'm doing is connected and has repercussions for people around the world and in my own community.
Well, I have to say, Terry Gibbs, it's an interesting I 100% agree with your point, but it also brings back memories that I got in a lot of trouble in the Buddhist community for writing some time back that I attended a conference in the Silicon Valley and wrote about it, and it was about how technology and Buddhism can work together. And I pointed out that you had a room full of people kind of celebrating Steve Jobs and the wonders of their iPhone without any consciousness of the Chinese workers that had been abused in the building of that iPhone, including those who had burned to death, potentially in the building of one that was in that room at that time. And, at that point, that was not a well-received argument. I think we have a construct, not all Western Buddhism, but first of all, that when we talk about Western Buddhism or Buddhism in the United States, we tend to omit people of Asian American ancestry who brought it with them, or whose ancestors brought it with them. We tend to think of Western converts to Buddhism, and that within that community, it's become almost, and I've written about this too with equally controversial results, I guess, that has become almost a kind of a consumer affectation that has become, on the one hand, a way to show that you're sort of hip and trendy, and like artisanal coffee or something. And on the other hand, it becomes a way when corporate-sponsored conferences are put together for corporate interests to promote the idea that their workers should be placating themselves with a kind of individualistic practice that makes them content to be part of a system that may not be moral. I know I just said a mouthful, and I'm sorry for that, but what are your thoughts on that, this kind of Western type of practice of Buddhism that I'm describing?
Yeah, you touch on a lot of really interesting points there. I think for a lot of people, it's uncomfortable to have their practice in any way sort of politicized, and they can feel like you're telling them that they need to think politically in a certain way if they're a Buddhist. And I've tried to be very careful in the way that I've talked about Buddhism in the book to suggest that I'm giving a particular interpretation, but not only that, I'm also trying to say, rather than say people should be Buddhists and socialists, and if they are, they should act this way, rather I'm trying to say these are potentially very useful lenses for us to look at some of the problems that we have right now in the world and the way in which we're responding to them and how we may respond to them more effectively. So if we can begin to see from a Buddhist perspective that our interactions with people and have impacts, and from a Marxist perspective that harms and structure, that violence can be within institutions, that institutions can be inherently violent processes, political processes can be inherently violent. We can see ways in which the consumer lifestyle, the individualist lifestyle that you were talking about just there, has its violent elements in terms of, and in the book I sort of talk about that as bodies in the basement, as this idea that at the end of a lot of our production and consumption processes are literally bodies, but sometimes it's other sorts of externalities like environmental pollution and things like that. But I think there is a discomfort amongst certain Buddhists for sure with the use of, or the sort of thinking of Buddhism in that way, and it can feel like some sort of violation. I think again, being able to sort of, as an educator, for me, the point is rather I'm not on a mission to convert people to become Buddhists or to become socialists, but rather to say, wow, there's a whole lot of rich things within both of these traditions that allow us, and my own personal interest has always been in how does the individual actions and activities that I engage in every day, do they have any impact on these structures that are out there, that are violent, that are hurting people, that are making our world so unequal? And if so, what is it that the choices that I should be making right now? And there's two pieces to that. One is, first of all, recognizing that whether we take any action or not in our lives, we are implicitly or explicitly, we're supporting certain values and value systems. So we can decide not to do anything, or we can be a bit more intentional about the choices we're making and a bit more make the lines of visibility, these connections, interconnections between people, between countries, more visible. And then consciously, we're mindfully acknowledging that we're making a choice about these decisions. If we choose fascism, if we choose to continue exploitation, if we choose those things, that would be not a good thing. But at least we are intentionally making a choice. And I think what's difficult a lot of the time is that it's almost as though we're not really making choices. And so people are blindly living individualist consumer lifestyles, and not because they're bad people and not because they want to hurt other people in other places, but because a lot of these connections are not visible to us. And the fact that we're actually making choices in what we're doing every day is not something that people are aware of.
Well, as a Zen priest said to me once, we are the people who are supposed to see to infinity, which is a kind of a stretch goal for me, frankly, but I get what she was saying, which was, to see all these connections that you describe, and I think it's important. I should say before we go, obviously, the Dalai Lama is a human being. He's not perfect. He said things, about women, LGBTQ people that, I wish he hadn't said, but he has opened up a very important line of teaching and exploration here, which you have pursued, and I'm grateful for that. So Terry Gibbs, author of Why the Dalai Lama is a Socialist, and what's the subtitle again? I'm sorry.
Buddhism, Socialism, and the Compassionate Society.
So, okay, well, author of that book, thank you for coming on. Thank you for your insights in this area, and thanks for your observations.
You're very welcome, Richard. And may I add just one
Of
comment
course, briefly.
as I depart?
Yeah.
One concept which I think is really important that is developed in the book is the idea of big C compassion. So when we recognize that a lot of the harms that we do as individuals in our daily lives are part of structures, we can begin to think about how do we make our political structures, our economic structures more compassionate, so we can take a structural view. And that's the advantage of being able to have both a Marxist and a Buddhist perspective.